Welcome to the Content 10X Podcast, the show where content creators learn how to harness the power of content repurposing. And now, your host, Amy Woods.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Content 10X Podcast. I'm your host, Amy Woods, and this week's episode is about making content go further by recognizing opportunities to break your content ideas down and not share everything at once. So you'll hear me talking about creating trilogies and series for your content. Now, you'll often hear me talk about how important it is to be consistent with our content. It's really, really important to be consistent with both your message and the frequency by which you put your content out. But it isn't easy as well. It can be really, really challenging. And I'll be absolutely the first to admit that for Content 10X Podcast and the blog with a weekly schedule, I've committed to this, but never missing a week has been really hard. Sometimes it can be so tough to plan the content out and work out what you want to share and talk about. And I think everybody sometimes has a content creator's block where you feel like, what am I going to talk about? You might feel like you've spoken about everything and it's just a natural creator's block. And then everything flows and everything comes and you realise, you can come bursting with ideas, but it can be really, really challenging. Now, a mistake that I see people make very often is they share too much in one go. And what I mean by this is, say you come up with an idea for some content and it's a really great idea and you create a blog post or a podcast or a video on this great idea and then it's huge. So like one of those really, really long podcast episodes or blog posts. So you might call it an epic piece of content. It's really, really dense with information, but actually what you could have done is break it down into not one podcast or video or blog post, but maybe 2, maybe 3, 4, maybe 10. So you've heard the motto many times, less is more, but actually what I'm saying here is more is more. So let's compare this to the movies. There's some great movies that are trilogies. So Back to the Future, Star Wars, actually that was 3 times 3 trilogies. That's actually 9 films. Indiana Jones, pretty much showing my age here, given these are all 80s films, but they're still really well-known popular films. And I just think it's fantastic that they were trilogies, and it would have been such a shame if they'd been shared as one single film. And my question to you is, do you have trilogies within your content ideas at the moment, or more than trilogies? So imagine if Lord of the Rings hadn't been a trilogy and instead it had been a 10+ hour film. So firstly, that's too long and no one would have watched it all. It would have been way, way, way too much. So the opposite, imagine if it had been one film but condensed those 3 films into just one film for 3 hours or 3.5 hours, whatever. So much would have been missed if they'd condensed it all into one, and that would have been a real shame as well. Now, another example, let's take Harry Potter. So there were 7 books with the Harry Potter series, and interestingly 8 films, because the final book, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, became 2 films, not one. Even though it was one book, it became 2 films, and that's because they felt that the final book being longer needed to be 2 films. They didn't want to neglect key aspects of the story, but I guess they thought they didn't also want to put out a 6 or 7 hour film. So the key important points of the story needed to stay, so it needed to be 2 films. Now imagine if J.K. Rowling had shared her entire story of Harry Potter, so her whole Harry Potter stories, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 books, instead of 7 books into one book. Imagine if she'd done that. It would have been such a shame. But my point here is that your content is similar. You might have multiple pieces of content and you're planning on sharing that. So multiple ideas to go into content, and you're planning to share all of it a bit too much together as single pieces of content, and it could be broken down. So let's say, for example, you were about to record a video on the best red wines for winter. And in that video, you were going to have 50 different wines that you take people through, 10 Italian, 10 French, 10 American, 10 Australian, 10 South African. Instead, why not have a 5-part series on the best red wines for winter? Episode 1 is on Italian wines, episode 2 is on the French wines, and so on. Or the same if this was a blog post, so a 5-part blog post series or 5-part podcast series. You don't need to share everything at once when there are opportunities to break it down. And sometimes sharing too much, it isn't great. For example, many of us have probably been to a movie where you've thought it was really good, but it was a bit too long. And you don't want people saying that about your content, because then they can start to zone out of it as well. So series can be really good. You can dig deeper into topics that you maybe weren't going to dig deep into because you felt like you wanted to share more in a single piece of content. So you can do more justice to the topic that you have planned. And also you can leave cliffhangers as well to get people to want to watch the next part of the series. So it promotes your next content, and you can encourage people to listen or read or watch the content before too. So you can refer back to earlier videos or podcast blog posts and tease the forward one as well. For example, a lot of movies do this when they plan to have sequels, and they'll tease the sequel and have some kind of cliffhanger that leave you wanting more. And TV shows do this as well. So recently I watched Stranger Things on Netflix. Really love that show and I've watched them all. And I really loved how for the 3 seasons they showed just enough at the end to tease that there was more to come. And it just leaves you excited for the next, in this case, the next series. But you can do this with your content as well if you break it down. You don't formally have to create a series either. It doesn't have to be a multiple part series, but just think about your content ideas. And are you putting too much into single pieces of content that you could break down and actually go into more depth and create more content? You may be sitting on certain content ideas that provide you with a few weeks worth of content, and you don't realize that actually viewing it from a different perspective, you actually have a few months worth of content there. So coming back to what I said at the start of this episode, we often hear the phrase less is more. But what I'm challenging you to think about with your content here is more, but just broken down into great pieces of content. So thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Content 10X podcast. So just to let you know, my brand new book, Content 10X, More Content, Less Time, Maximum Results, is now published. It's out and it's available to buy on Amazon. So thank you to everybody who has purchased the book so far. And thank you so much to leaving a review if you've left a review. If you like the book and you have it, please do leave a review. It really helps on Amazon. And if you don't have it, then what are you waiting for? Go ahead and get the book. I can guarantee it really is your one-stop shop for lots and lots and lots of content repurposing tricks and tips and tactics and strategies for almost pretty much every type of content. And if you want help with your content repurposing, then never hesitate to get in touch, because we offer a fully end-to-end content repurposing service here at Content 10X. So for the book, go to Amazon or go to content10x.com/book. And for our service, if you just go to our website, you'll see lots of information about the service that we provide as well. Now, do give me a follow on social media as well, because I'm always sharing tips and advice on social media too. And I also sometimes attempt to be funny to varying degrees of success. That's at Content 10X on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. So thank you so much for listening to this week's episode, and I'll catch you in the next one.